This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to BISP Solution. My name is Ashish Kumar Jain. I am working as a functional consultant for BISP. Today, we would be taking a session on IFRS 16 leases. IFRS 16 is developed as a set of accounting standards effective for annual reporting of leased assets beginning on or after 1st Jan 2019. So, what is a lease? A lease is a contract between the owner of the asset, that is the lessor, and another party that wants to use the asset, that is the lessee. The lessee gains the right to use the asset for the period of time in return for periodic lease payment. Usually, property, building, and vehicles are common assets that are leased. Now, IFRS 16 has certain objectives. The very first being faithfully represent lease transaction, and second is to provide a basis for users of financial statement to assess the amount, timing, and uncertainty of cash flow arising from leases. To meet that objective, a lessee should recognize assets and liabilities arising from a lease. So, IFRS 16 inculcates the use of capital lease for representing the balance sheet and income statement. So, what is a capital lease and what are its accounting treatment? A capital or finance lease is a lease in which the risk and reward inherent in the assets are transferred to the lessee. The accounting treatment of capital lease is similar to that of purchasing an asset and financing the purchase with long-term loan. Now, the accounting treatment for capital lease is as follows. Accounting entries at inception. In balance sheet, the present value of lease payment is recognized as a long-lived asset. The same amount is also recognized as a non-current liability. In the initial year, since there is no payment of interest, therefore there is no effect on his income statement, as well as there is no effect on cash flow statement because there has been no cash transaction. Now, in the subsequent year, in the balance sheet, the value of asset falls every year and it is depreciated. Interest is charged on the liability as the appropriate discount rates time the beginning of the year value of the liability. Also, in income statement, the depreciation expense is charged and also interest expense is charged every year. Depreciation expense is charged against the asset and interest expense is charged on the liability. Cash flow statement also have effect in the subsequent year. The portion of lease payment, that is interest expense, is subtracted from cash flow from operating activities, while the remainder that serves to reduce the liability is subtracted from cash flow from financing activity. So, to beginning with utilizing the IFRS 16 guidelines, we have in financial consolidation closed cloud the methods by which we could utilize and input the lease asset data in order to calculate the value of lease asset and also its effect on balance sheet. We have our IFRS 16 card in which we will have our task, our overview and schedules. Simultaneously, we can also have what if analysis and a simulation. So before beginning to understand how it works in the application, let's take a simple example on Excel to understand how the leasing works. Now, let us take an example of a lease asset. Consider we have a lease contract where we have a obligation of lease payment of 10,000 USD per year. Consider the prevailing interest rate or the discount rate being the 7%. We have a lease term of 4 years that becomes our useful life. We have a salvage value. Consider we do not have any salvage value for our particular lease asset, so keep it 0. And we would be using a straight line depreciation method for the purpose of calculating depreciation. Now, as per IFRS 16 guideline, the present value of lease is taken as the value of lease asset and is posted in our balance sheet. So let's calculate the present value for the annual payment of 10,000. So we would be using the inbuilt present value function for the purpose of calculating present value. I'm using minus sign so as to get a positive value. So we use PV function. We define the rate, the number of periods for which the lease contract is signed, and the monthly payment. This gives us the present value of lease. This particular present value will become our beginning liability, and the depreciation that is to be charged is calculated on present value. So using the straight line function, we would first calculate our depreciation. So our depreciation being using straight line method, we need to define the cost of asset, that being the present value, our salvage value, and the total life or the contract period. So our depreciation expense for this particular lease contract would amount to be 8,468 to be charged per year. Now let's take into account how the interest and payment and principal repayment calculation will be done. So our beginning liability will be the present value of asset. Now we have to pay interest, and that interest is paid on the present value. Okay. So the present value interest calculation will be taken into account by taking the interest rate and multiplying the same to the beginning liability. So a total of 2,371 is the interest payment for year 1. And what would be our principal repayment? The total annual payment minus the interest payment. This will be our principal repayment part. So this total constitute the total annual amount. Now our closing liability will be the beginning liability minus the principal repayment part. So at the end of the year, our closing liability would come out to be 26,243. Now this closing liability will become our opening liability for the subsequent year. Now in the year 2, we will again calculate our interest taking the same interest rate utilizing a beginning liability. I am blocking the interest rates because we have to use the same interest rate again. We just multiply and it by our beginning liability to get the interest rate, and we subtract this interest from annual payment to get the principal repayment amount. And our closing liability then will become beginning liability minus principal repayment part. So in the subsequent year, our interest part reduces and our principal repayment part increases. Just using the same values for our beginning liability, we could calculate the remaining accordingly. So as you see, we started with a beginning liability of 33,872, and in the subsequent year with the total annual payment, our liability has reduced to 0. So how the same would be included in our balance sheet? So our lease asset being the present value of lease, so it will remain the same for all the years, and our depreciation would be, let me just log the cell so that I do not have to, I could just drag it. Okay, so our lease asset value remains the same for all the years. Now what would be our accumulated depreciation? So since in the period 0, that is the initial year, since we haven't utilize any depreciation expense. So a depreciation for the initial year will remain 0, and our lease asset value will be net lease asset value will be lease asset minus depreciation. Now, as we move to second year, we will take in the depreciation expense and we will subtract our liability lease asset minus accumulated depreciation to our net lease asset value. Now, as the depreciation is charged over and over again, we'll have the depreciation being accumulated until it is charged in our expense sheet. So as of now, just taking into account that we are accumulating our depreciation will keep on increasing till it reach the exact value as our lease asset value, and our net lease asset value will reduce subsequently in the coming years. Similarly, let's have a look on our liability part. So, how a liability part will work? So, the current portion of lease liability will be our principal repayment part. Okay, so just drag the same so as to get our lease liability obligations. What would be our debt obligation? Our debt obligation would be the closing liability. So we'll take into account the closing liability as a debt obligation, long-term debt obligation. And what would be our total liability that is to be posted? It will be the sum of current portion of lease plus the long-term debt obligation. So as we move further, our total liability in the final year of our lease contract will reduce to 0. Now let's take the same into account into our application, how it works in our application. Now, for the purpose of calculating the lease contract, we initially have to create a supplemental data input form which would be utilized for the purpose of inputting our leased value. For the purpose of same, we will first open a period for which we would be submitting our data. So let's take into account year 2018 to be our starting period. We have an open period in here. Just save it. We have our dimensions which would be utilized. Then we have a data set, and in data set we create a leasing IFRS leasing data set with all the required attributes, being the lease contract, the lease start date and date, number of periods, interest rate, start year, end year, and all other attributes. These attributes would be then used for the purpose of creating a form template which would be utilized for the purpose of submitting our lease asset data. So under sections, you will have the IFRS leasing input, where you see we have all the variables or attributes that would be utilized for the purpose of submitting our data. Just save and close, and we need to deploy the form in order to allow a user to submit the data. Now, before beginning, what we need to do, we have to define a workflow. Under workflow, we have to define an entity, a user, and an integrator. So let me delete the other columns first so that it does not create multiple entities for which we need to submit data. We will take into account a single entity as of now for the purpose of understanding. We would be submitting our lease data for entity 2. We need to assign a preparer for the same. So let me assign one of the user as preparer, and let me assign the same user as integrator so as the same user could be used to post the data. Just save and close. Go to actions and deploy. In order to deploy the form, we need to select the proper period. We have an open period for 2080 actuals. We just select the period and deploy the form. It takes a few moments for the form template to get deployed. Once a form is deployed, we could use the same. So we have a successfully deployed form. Now, in order to provide the information with regard to the contract, just move to the card IFRS 16, go to task, go to supplemental data tasks and select the year. We have a open period being Jan, scenario actual. We have our form template design, IFRS leasing form. So this is the form which gets deployed and which would be utilized for the purpose of inputting data. Just open the form. Okay, so you could input multiple number of data, but for the purpose of understanding, let's take one lease asset into account and just click add. So these are the attributes which gets open for the purpose of submitting the information with regard to a lease asset. So first select one of your leased asset. Define the start date of the lease. So let's have a period beginning from 1st Jan 2018. Our lease end date. So it's giving error. We need to define it as Jan first, not as 1st Jan. So Jan 1st, 2018, our lease start date, and December 31st, 2022. Let's keep 2022 as our lease end date. Now let's define our interest rate. So suppose we are keeping an interest rate of 4%. Now the annual payment being, let's assume we are paying 12 lakhs as our annual payment. Okay, and we need to define the entity exchange rate. So we would be using our USD. After we have provided with this minimal information, you just save the form, and we have our number of periods being calculated, our interest rate being calculated, start year, start month, and end month being calculated with the calculation of periodic payment and also total annual payment. Just submit the same and you post it. So once the supplemental data input has been posted, You go to your IFRS16 overview. Here you could see we have our input for our lease 1. Now we need to calculate the schedules, and we need to identify what would be our profit and loss impact and balance sheet impact. So before beginning to calculate or consolidate the rule, let's check out the calculation on Excel. What are the formulas that are to be used in order to calculate the profit and loss statement and balance sheet by. So we have this particular input. We have our start date being 1st Jan 2018, the end date being 31st December 2022 with an interest rate of 4% and annual payment. So we have to create a schedule in order to calculate the present value. Now, there are two formulas that are used for the purpose of calculating present value. There is a formula for calculating present value being future value divided by discount factor, and discount factor is calculated as 1 plus interest rate to the power of number of period. So we would be utilizing our discount factor, taking into account the future value and dividing the same with discount factor to calculate a present value. So this will create a schedule. So we have number of period in here. We need a interest rate. So let's take the interest rate from our input form. I'm locking the same because the interest rate will remain the same for the total periods. Our discount factor being 1 plus our interest rate to the power of number of periods. So this is our discount factor that would be utilized for the purpose of calculating our discount factor. Just drag the same. Now to calculate present value, we need to have a payment amount, and our payment amount is the annual monthly, not the annual payment, sorry, the monthly payment. So taking monthly payment into account for all the years, we will calculate a present value periodic. So annual payment, or sorry, the monthly payment divided by monthly discount factor will give our monthly present value, and just click. So this is the present value, and the sum of present value will result into the overall present value of the lease asset. The sum of present value coming out to be 2262349. This is gonna be our present value for this particular lease asset. So in the similar manner, we will take this as our brought forward liability, and our interest will then be calculated as our present value multiplied by interest rate, and our capital balance would be payment amount minus interest rate. So just double click the same so as to create the balance sheet. As I do the calculations, brought for carry forward liability will be what forward liability minus capital balance. This will become our next year, next period brought forward liability. Accordingly, I'm just dragging the formula, so we'll get our calculations done accordingly. So at the end of the period, the total lease asset liability value will come out to be 0. Now, what will be a right of use of asset? So this is the lease asset part. So this will remain fixed as our present value. We need to calculate a depreciation expense. So depreciation expense being, we will use the formula SLN cost, just log the cost, comma, we have 0 salvage value, and we have a useful life of 60 periods, that is 60 months. So just take into account 60 months. So this will give us a depreciation expense. Just double click or drag to calculate the depreciation expense. And what will be our accumulated depreciation? This will be depreciation expense into number of periods. So this is how we will calculate our accumulated depreciation and depreciation expense. And what would be our net book value as right of use of asset? It will be right of use of asset minus total depreciation. So as our liabilities reduce accordingly, and at the end of the period, our liability will reduce to 0. So this is the balance sheet that is created for a particular lease asset. Now, let's have a look of the same in our application. We just run the consolidate rule and all the calculations are done automatically by application. The schedules are created and also the balance sheet and profit and loss statement gets created. It takes a few moments for the calculation to get completed. So if you move to IFRS 16 schedules, you will have a schedule being calculated with the discount factor and the present value, similar to the calculations that we make in our application. We have the same value 96153, 96153. We have our profit and loss impact calculated for all the periods. We have a balance sheet impact with the brought forward liability, the interest rate, the capital balance, monthly payment, and carry forward liability accordingly. So this is how our calculation takes place in our application for the purpose of calculating lease asset value. If you move to IFRS dashboard, you could have a pictorial representation of the same. Since we have only one entity input, so we have one entity data. Okay, there are other calculations also being done for the same. So this is how we could input a lease asset value and have all the calculations done by the application for the purpose of calculating a balance sheet and profit and loss statement. And we could also generate a report. We have a report now IFRS 16 adjustments. We have a profit and loss adjustment report created. We have a balance sheet report being created accordingly. So this is how all the calculation takes place for actuals. Now, there might be scenarios where we need to identify what if there is a change in our existing lease asset contract. For example, if there is a change in interest rate or monthly payment or the period, then we need to have a look of the same and identify what and how the changes will affect our lease contract. For that, we need to use the card as IFRS 16. What if? Again, we have to create a supplemental data form for the same for what if analysis. So we have a what if analysis form for leasing purpose, IFRS 16 what if form. it have all the similar sections. There is a workflow of the same. Okay, just let me delete these entries so that we could have a clean example. Okay, so suppose just keep the same user as our preparer and integrator. Just save and close. Now, before beginning, we need to open a period for which we have to identify what if analysis. So we have to select the scenario as what if, and suppose there is a change being done in year 2019. So we have to open a period for 2019. We need to select the date. So 2019 being our open period, we will take 2018 December as our start date for the purpose of preparation. We will have our end date again as December ending, and our close date again. We go to December and we have a close date being 31st. Just save and open period. Now again we need to move to our what if card. We need to go to task, use the supplemental data form, select the period which we opened for the purpose of analyzing or doing a what if analysis. Select the period. The scenario will be now what if scenario, and our template would be IFRS 16. So we just missed one thing, we haven't deployed our IFRS 16 form. So first we have to deploy the form. Go to form template, go to action and deploy the form. Select the period for which we need to make our analysis, what if analysis, being 2019, scenario being what if. Select the period and deploy our form. So it will take few moments to get the form deployed. So we have a form successfully being deployed. We move to our card, what if card. Go to task and we again select the year. Scenario being our what if scenario, and our what if template. So this is our what if scenario. Now we know that we had a contract, the same contract. So we will just make changes in that particular contract. Suppose we take into account the same lease with a start date. Now suppose we have a change in date being Jan 1st 2019, and we have extended our contract period to December 31st. Instead of 2022, we have extended our lease contract to 2025. and we have a change in interest rate as 0.5%, and we have a change in annual payment being 15 lakh. Okay, just save the what if form. So we have our calculations being done, submit the same, and once we post, we will have our input in our application for the purpose of consolidating and calculating the schedules. So go to what if overview. So we need to select the entity. So we have what if schedules. Just run consolidate and so the what if scenario form has a lock period of 18. We have to enable period 19 for the same. So for that purpose, let's open the form, data form 32. Go to layout and just add financial year 19, save and finish. In the schedules, we have to change the same in here. Save and finish. So let's check whether we are getting our numbers or not. So this is our calculations, and under schedules, go to balance sheet and select the year, and we will have a profit and loss impact calculations being shown in here. So we have a different entity, so we are not getting our balance sheet in here. We again have to select the entity in our form. So this is how our what if scenario will work for the purpose of calculations. This is the dashboard that is being created. So this is all that we have for our IFRS 16 for financial consolidation and close cloud. Thank you for being part of BISP